Sam from SK. In this episode, we're going to talk about fermentation in the coffee process. Now, it's kind of a mysterious, somewhat complicated, and perhaps a little bit contentious, I'm not going to lie. So up front, I want to state that I will not be making any definitive statements that I believe are facts or any kind of gospel or whatnot. You're going to see a lot of that out there, but really, first and foremost, the deal is we're still really trying to understand how fermentation actually affects specifically flavor in coffee, but we do know that it is important for darn near every lot of coffee that you've ever had. The first way that fermentation is used, probably the simplest way rather, is kind of as a barrier between the coffee seed, the bean that we call inside the cherry, and then what we can then, the product that we can then roast. That cherry is pretty dense and likes to stick to the seed inside. Imagine kind of peeling and pulling a peach, the peach rind off the pit. It's tough. So imagine doing that by hand for every single cherry. It would not work. So basically, the simplest way that fermentation is used is actually a way to kind of loosen the rind or the mucilage off of the pit or the seed or the bean. With that said, let's say that a cherry is picked and then depulped right away. So in a kind of manual or automated, some kind of machine depulper, and now it's the seed with some mucilage around it. Now, if we wash that down little troughs, you've probably seen pictures, and then dried that on, and then it's usually sat in little vats for, I think, 12 to 24 hours about. And so it's very minor fermentation. Really, it's just kind of letting it sit and exposed to the elements and within itself so the microbes can kind of soften. You wash it again, you dry it. That's called the wash method. That's the most clean and typical method that is used in specialty coffee today. Let's say you depulp that cherry and you let the cherry dry under the sun. You don't do anything. That's called the natural method. Now, that obviously has fermentation because it's fruit, right? It's a fruit rind that's essentially rotting under the sun and can be dried up to 30 days. Now, if you depulp it, just like in the wash method, and you dry it inside that mucilage, that's what's called the honey process. And both the natural and the honey process have pretty similar flavor characteristics that come out. Largely a very bright, fruity, kind of fruit bomb, you might hear people say, flavor note. There is this other method of fermentation, which is essentially experimental fermentation. Things like carbonic maceration fermentation comes off the top of my head, or this sort of yellow, red, or purple honey processes. These are all experimental in nature and somewhat controversial as to their effect to flavor in coffee. Now, it's not politics, but you could probably argue that there's some economic politics that surrounds experimental fermentation. But really, what we're trying to do is, not to overuse the phrase, but experiment with that fermentation process to see if the way that those fruits and all the microbes within the fruit itself can affect and create an affect onto the seed inside of it. Now, unlike wine, which a lot of coffee experimental fermentation is drawing on, that industry, the wine industry. Now, unlike that, where the wine is manipulating the fruit, right, and the juices from the fruit, and they want little to nothing to do with the pit. The wonderful fermentation specialist, Lucia Solis, describes how in coffee, we only want the pit, right? The pit is the coffee bean that we roast and brew. So we're doing all these fermentations to the fruit, and the juices and the mucilage around the pit, and yet we're discarding that. So where things are a little mysterious and where I think kind of the future of kind of flavor exploration is in figuring out how that experimental fermentation can actually affect and how to harness that affect into the seed itself. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this was a helpful sort of very overview of the fermentation process. Remember to like and subscribe to the SK Vlog. See you next week.